welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. This is Lowell, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sherry.
Hello.
And this month we have Sawyer Rankin of Fahrenheit Games, who's written a number of Monsterhearts pieces and a prolific GM on the Gauntlet. So thank you for joining us, Sawyer.
No problem. Happy to be here.
And so for our first segment each month, we take a look at games that we've played on the Gauntlet. We talk about one of those in a little more detail. So, Sherry, we're going to start with you. We're looking back at June. So tell us, how was your June?
My June was a little mellow just because I had a large project coming due, but I still got quite a few games in. I was maybe kind of stretching it, but I survived, so all is good. Off Gauntlet, I played 13th Age. I also played Hearts of Wulin's The Supernatural Playbooks, and we played Star Trek Adventures, an express hack where essentially all the parts that someone thinks we don't need, we don't worry about, we just play Star Trek, and it's been super fun. You'll notice that the theme of all my games seems to be comfort games and cozy games, and that's a lot of what's going on right now. On Gauntlet, I played Brindlewood Bay, more of that series. It's been wonderful to get back to it. Also played Changeling the Lost PBTA, The Hack, with a different GM. Jamila ran that one, so that was fun. And the game that I'm going to talk about today, played Gauntlet City Comics Summer Crossover with the system Hearts and Souls. So essentially Hearts and Souls is a lightweight supers system that was written by Tim Kirk of Silver Lion Studios. It's been around since the early 2000s.
Yeah, it's definitely an older supers game.
So Rich just picked it up because he liked that it was lightweight and it had some bits in it that he thought looked interesting, so we decided to play it. And we ended up going with a very small campaign. It was Rich running and 2 players, myself and Laura. So it was a really nice, comfortable little situation where it was just intense, supers fun for 2 people. And we got a lot of screen time. We got to do a lot of the things that we wanted to do. And the system actually worked out really well for that. Hearts and Souls is a narrative supers game. It has these dice pools and a sort of power sets that are kind of make your own. You have these kind of basic ideas that you can sort of mix and match together and give yourself ratings on. But it helps if you have a very strong sense of what you actually can do. It leans on the supers tropes of drives, essentially like what makes you want to be a super or makes you want to help or do what you're doing. And the drive-related monologuing in the game that's used for rerolls is a lot of fun. And there's these interesting stress reactions that you have that flavor up damage taking. So you have a lot of chances to express your character and to do very standard superhero trope things. It's a lot of fun. This game was run as part of the Gauntlet City Comics Summer Crossover. So there are a lot of other tables that are running parts of this story too. It's essentially a crossover, so multiple timelines. The Gauntleteer has gone missing. People have to look for the Gauntleteer. Whatever incarnation of the Gauntleteer exists in their world. So we were back in the 1980s. And we had a cool Gauntleteer called Neon Hero who went missing. And the whole thing of being part of that summer crossover means that we're navigating a certain amount of meta, as is the GM. And it was kind of fun. We were very light with our touches on it, but we did hit a few characters and references to previous things, sometimes whether we knew it or not. So that was part of the sort of environment that this game was being played. So it's the thing of when you're talking about a system or a play experience, you're bringing in all of the other pieces of it. There's not just the system, but it's who you're with and essentially what are some of the constraints on the game. So for us, it was that we were trying to keep a sort of consistency with a world outside. What worked for me with this game really were I loved the drives. I think that I'd sort of drive-centric approach for supers makes a lot of sense. Being able to monologue was kind of fun, though we used that only a little bit and quite lightly because we were rolling really well. And it was one of those things is that it is a thing for a reroll. So we didn't get to monologue as much as we might have. Usually if my dice were how they usually are, I would have been monologuing a lot more. I enjoyed the power sets, which were very simple. You could set them up. But the thing is that combination of 3 really delivered the sort of super stories that I dig. It's a sort of striving super who's got flaws and virtue. And I think that changing the drives, like if you were to play longer, and what you did is every once in a while when there was a life change for your super, you changed the drives. That actually makes more sense for a sort of story progression for a superhero in some ways than getting more powers or things like that, or getting stronger. I mean, maybe you get a little something new, but mostly I think the drives really give a good sense of story progression. So that's when I look at it. The dice pools and resolution, for me, hit that sweet spot where you get to describe what you're doing, but it doesn't bog down into a series of permissions roles. You know, you have to do this thing in order to be able to do that thing, which I kind of think of as a sort of trad gaming problem for super systems a lot of times. But the thing I like about it is still a doing role. You say, I'm going to do this thing, and then you worry about what the effect is, rather than having to figure out what your effect is that you want and then try to cram in the description of what you're doing. So sometimes for supers, that's a thing that I really like, and the PBTA supers often use that effect first, then describe. For me, that's a thing that my heart feels sad about sometimes. So I was very pleased to be back to being able to say what I was going to do and then work out what that looked like with the effect that I ended up rolling. The other thing I have to say is that if playing a 2-player super game is awesome. It is all about the team because it's just the two of you. And so even when you're separate, it's about the team because because you are all there is of that team. You get to develop really fast and touch things a lot and be a part of everything without having to worry about taking all the spotlight. And we got a lot done. The story was smaller because we were low power in some ways, but it was really good, fun character story as much as anything. And we were particularly super heroic by the end of it. So it was very fun. If there's anything I'm uncertain about, this is the game, not particularly just the system. There were a few times where we were mildly confused by some of the stress tech and the names for the stress tech in the system. But part of that could have been our inattention to the rules early on because we 2 players, we just got in there, filled out our character sheets, and we were playing. So we didn't go through all of it. And so I think sometimes part of it was just our misunderstanding of what we thought it was going to do. The other thing that we hit is we had 2 really sweet, nice superheroes. So our monologues were about not disappointing each other or not letting anyone get hurt. So I think that with longer play or more players, that would have really increased the drama potential for those golden opportunities of monologuing. We just didn't get into the big heroic-y ones. We were very much down there in the trenches trying to be good to each other. The other thing was we were in a lived-in world, but we were in the past. So there were references to the Gauntlet City Comics canon that may or may not have been meaningful to more than one person at the table. It was one of those things that there's always that little problem with canon. So the only things about the game that I was like, maybe those are not 100% for anyone watching or coming in, but they were fine. They didn't get in the way of the game, so I'm good with that. And the thing was, my takeaway for this is clearly we were just playing this because Rich had picked the game out, hadn't thought anything about it, and we found out mid-series that the designer is working on a 2nd edition. And I'd be very curious to look at that because I really enjoyed just how lightweight this was and how it put forward the parts of supers that I really enjoy. I'm a big softie for supers games that let me get into the weeds just a little bit, just enough to feel like I've got, I'm there in the big superpowers wilderness, figuring things out, doing stuff, but not so much that I need to have studied manuals like you have to if you're using champions. So I really like it's just kind of like a little bit of camping for supers, but easy camping, glamping for supers games. And I love team play and emotions, and this game delivered those. So I had a lovely time.
This is a sense of the system. Like, what does combat look like?
In a combat situation, you declare what you're going to do. You've got some dice pool, but the dice pool is very simple. If you're doing something that's your human stats, you're going to be rolling d4s and trying to break a difficulty. If you're doing something superhero, you're rolling d8s and you're trying to break a difficulty. Of course, for the low-level things, breaking difficulties with your superhero is much easier. So d4s versus d8s, and of course, if you're trying to game it, you're always trying to be doing your best thing in superheroes because your number of your dice is based on your ratings that you give to your abilities. And so your human abilities are mostly the social things of getting along and being deft and just as yourself. Then your super abilities. Those D8s are a much smaller group that are just about the power sets that you have. Does that make any sense? So it's
Yeah,
a very
absolutely.
quick negotiation of human, superhero, which of your things that you're doing, pick up those dice, roll them. And then if you don't roll enough to beat the difficulty, he's going to say you're going to need to hit 7s or something like that. Then you get to re-roll with a monologue. We also put in a rule for helping where you could monologue to help another person.
Sawyer, do you have some questions? I know you run a lot of supers.
I have never heard of the system. It sounds a lot like it was like playing out a joined relationship from Masks, but just a lot more in-depth than that playbook combo may allow. And the monologue thing reminds me of my favorite bit from the Infernals of Exalted 2.5, where it's like you can get rid of your demonic lord's influence by expounding your plans just enough that people have a chance to defeat you.
Oh, that's great.
Well, and I think we use mostly internal monologues. So,
Okay.
But that's because we were playing just little baby superheroes, It just, so we were all for trying to just can't let them down. So it was all insecurity. It was fun.
Well, good. Glad you had a good time. And it's always good to hear another superhero game being played and tried out. So, Sawyer, why don't you tell us about your June?
June was busy with games. I'm running more than I'm playing, but I was running Apocalypse World. I was actually playing some Sword Crown and Unspeakable Power for a little bit. Got to on the Gauntlet, I got to play a wonderful game of Visigoths versus Molgoths, and ran Masks. I am running one of the stories of the Gauntlet City Comics Summertime crossover. Also, the game I'm going to be talking about today, Monsterhearts 2, in my Dark Americana setting on the Gauntlet.
Ooh, interesting. Okay, tell us about this.
The Dark Americana idea for me on the Gauntlet was just looking up at all these urban fantasy novels, comic books, movies. It's like, I meet a vampire in New York. My werewolf actor boyfriend in L.A. My cool ghost girlfriend in Montreal. It's like there are more places in these vast areas that can be covered. So with me, Dark Americana is getting into those places. This is a place in Utah that is not part of a church. If you've lived in the South or any smaller locations, like just turning down a road, going 20 miles and finding a small town. And Monsterhearts 2 itself is a game of sexy urban fantasy teenagers by Avery Alder of Buried Without Ceremony. Monsterhearts 2 is the second edition and a great upgrade for the system, and really helped facilitate this entire thing, and is the vanguard of the Dark Americana series, because what better game for small towns than Monsterhearts 2?
True.
This was set in Algonquin territory in a fake town of Absolution, Ontario. It was a big schism between the fact that many reservations were allowed to grow marijuana before it became legal in 2018, and the fact that a bit of that tension of, you're fine being our dealers, you can't be our bosses at the dispensary. That's a bit of a schism, and of course the people who didn't have this prejudice are the teenagers. So that's the best action. With the game itself, the players were great. They created these monsters that just went into the town. It was like if the CW did the Dresden Files to me. It was just enough action, just enough drama, just enough really messy relationships, like the ghoul having to choose, do I eat the guy who I'm going out with in my darkest hunger, or eat his best friend and risk him not going out with me? It started off small, I guess, like with any kind of PBTA game. You don't just start off snowballing going to fight Sauron in these kinds of games, and but we actually got to a party in session 2, which is I have never had happen in any Monster Hearts game before. Gerwin, bless his heart, gave me enough rope to make a noose for his character and just went with it totally, as his vampire sire was a much less emotional twin sister. So we got the telenovela feel in this.
Nice.
The ghost was our everyman. It was gripping. It was it felt like performance art more than a game. The Ghoul was based on something I'll talk about later with like the Windigo overlay. I love the feeling of Monsterhearts 2 because many games in the role-playing settings, like with high fantasy, you're getting a Tolkien-esque fantasy most of the time. With urban fantasy, you're getting Dresden Files, you're getting Supernatural, you're getting what has become a cookie cutter. Whereas like in Monsterhearts 2, it's like, you can be the popular dragon. You can be the kick-ass fae. Like, you're not tied to that lens.
Mm-hmm.
It feels more free-form with how you can portray these metaphorical monsters and literal teenagers. Just, I can see how it's not everyone's game with certain mechanics, but just the tie-in is great for me, and biased because it was the first introduction to PBTA I ever had. While it is very great at setting up the small-town, claustrophobic, gripping and gritty amount of play, like, it would be hard to set in New York. It would be harder to set in LA, like maybe a borough or a neighborhood. But like in a big city, it would be hard to do, and mechanically, I think it's still clunky to try and get the MC's characters or NPCs to do what you want in a crunch sense. Like, you know, it is easy to talk them down narratively, try and provoke them, but the system of tempting them with a string is kind of hard. It's like the only way to generally get strings is be sexy or be mean. And if they're a character who's older or younger than your own, that gets into territory many are kind of iffy on.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, there are reactions to cover that, but that is, as I said, it's still a bit clunky. And
okay.
I think for a PBTA game, it also does not talk about custom moves and reactions as much as I'm used to. But the other game I'm used to is Apocalypse World 2nd Edition, which is like explaining every gyro on the Rat Trap game.
Mm-hmm.
I think if it had more clarity on how to write custom reactions for your big threat NPCs, or custom reactions for this world set in Kansas, when you go into the corn maze, do X, it would have a bit more modularity for new MCs. But otherwise, like, Monsterhearts 2 feels one of the polished gems of the PBTA lineup that is out there to me.
In terms of the Dark Americana and sort of picturing of the kinds of towns, you ended up doing it in Canada rather than yeah. So what made you decide to do that choice?
To me, Americana means Mexico, America, and Canada, not just USA. I don't want to have that mindset of just having started on the Gauntlet. I was used to seeing games like set in Alaska from the Codex is called or like an Apocalypse World set in Britain. But I didn't see much in Canada. I didn't see much, like, besides Nahual, I didn't see much in Mexico. I want to learn, like, expose myself to as much new culture as I can to do this, and to expose cultures and outlooks that may not be done even commonly in PBTA games, like the Asian towns in Seattle, or the those boroughs that intersect like the Hispanic populations. Just, I want to see more than LA and New York.
Excellent. Sherry, questions?
So when you're putting these together, what is your first thought of what you're facilitating? Like, what are you doing when you're doing that so that you have something for your characters to grab onto?
The way I do it, like, even like for the game, the first one I ran was set in Kula, Hawaii, which I would do things like I call it like the 3-part system: 2 parts new things, 1 thing to grasp onto. So it is Kula, Hawaii. A lot of us aren't from Hawaii. It is the part that did not have the tourist department, but it did have a big Catholic church. Like, in real life, so like, tie the Catholic Church to many people's ideas of what it is to grow up in America, and it just gave them things to grapple onto. And everyone on the Gauntlet also did great research into just what Kula was like, since it was based on a real place, and how to base their characters off that due to their characters' outlooks, versus I want to be a vampire, but like, I need to find a way to put that in.
Mm-hmm. Like, how does that fit in the thing? So I like that idea of having that thing that they go, okay, here's a touchstone that I think I'm familiar with, to give them something to ground themselves on in the moment.
Awesome.
It's always a thing when things are exotic.
Well, let me talk about my June. Off Gauntlet, 13th Age, Star Trek Adventures Express, and Hearts of Within. On Gauntlet, I got to play Changing the Lost PBTA for the first time since I've always run it. And then I ran the Sprawl Touched Prime. Last month I had run another one of these supernatural reframings for the Sprawl, which is a cyberpunk mission-based game. It was quite good. Essentially, we just made it Shadowrun, and that worked. I've also done sessions of Godbound because they had done a bundle of holding a couple months back. I wanted to run that, and I really like Godbound. But the game I want to talk about is Agon, and I'm going to say Agon. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. So Agon is a new game from John Harper and Sean Nittner from Evil Hat. It's a revised edition of an earlier game. It's an epic of mythic Greek antiquity. You're heroes on a ship, and you're returning from a war, but when you sail out on the ship, your way is barred by mists. And then each session you arrive at a new island, and there's a new problem that you have to solve. And then solving problems gains you the favor of the gods. And eventually, once you gain enough favor, you can return home. It's a dice pool system. Create dice, like I'm going to do these things to get this many dice. Combined with a very structured play, like Blades in the Dark, it's on John Harper's other game. I have to give a shout out to David Walker, because this was a game that I had gotten, and we're really lucky on the Gauntlet. A lot of people will post on our Slack for, hey, I want to play this game, and somebody posted, David Walker posted that he wanted to play Agon, and I was like, oh, I'll run it. I hadn't read it yet. I'm so glad I did. Let me just, the bottom line I'm going to say is that this is one of the most fun games I've run in a very long time. Completely unexpected for me. The premise is really well thought out. It keeps this epic feel throughout. Your character's made with a name, and you get a die from your name, and then you get an epithet like many-wayed or pure-hearted. You get that gets you a die. The kinds of tasks are like arts and oration or blood or valor. All of it plays into that feel of it. So it always has that high mythic feel. It's got a structure like Blades, where we've got segments. You do this thing, and then we do the sailing phase, and then we do the leadership phase, and we arrive. But it feels like there's more room for character play than there are in Blades, or at least a little more focus. And when we go to the downtime phase, where sometimes in Blades that can feel like a real record scratch, like we're going to stop and do something very different now, downtime here feels very organic. It plays into what goes on. You can see where it shapes it, and it develops connections between players. The contests, when you do it like a contest to do something, they resolve big questions. It's not like, okay, well, let's do the blow by blow, or even this is the first step of the battle. The contest is, this is what the stakes are. Let's resolve it, and then let's see what happens. And an interesting mechanic in it that I didn't know if I was going to like is that if multiple people are kind of fighting a monster and they're all kind of doing the same contest, then everybody can win. But when you have a contest, you get a certain amount of glory for your character. And if you're the person who did the best against the monster, you get the most glory. Everyone else who succeeds against the monster gets half of that. And glory is your experience. And so it's got this, I don't want to say PvP, but it's got this competition. Long story short, at the end of the game, after 4 sessions, everybody was within 5-10% of one another. Like, I think the highest was like 192, and I think the lowest was like 178. So my worries that it would get uneven or that it would get out of shape did not come to bear. There's a lot more to say about it, but it's a great book. Like, the rules look hard. It takes a bit to get used to them, but the book's really excellent. It's beautifully laid out. It's got tons of islands. I only did 4 of them. I could have run this 3 or 4 more times of 4 sessions each and never use the same island. Plus, we use the Roll20 character sheets, which normally I don't really care for Roll20, but the character sheets are really good. And now Evil Hat has done some other things, like they've got zoom backdrops set for Agon. I used those, and now they've got a toolkit for it on Roll20. So all just really good stuff. So that's all the good stuff. And now I'm going to say some less good stuff, but I want to make it absolutely clear that this is on my top 10 games that I would pick up and run just at a drop of a hat from now on. I will say this. The game has a lot of mechanical steps, and when you first read through it, I didn't know what the shape of it was. Like, I couldn't quite tell. It took it a couple of times reading through it. Once I got it to the table and played it out, I was like, oh, I see what's going on here. But at first read, it's hard to kind of, in your mind, picture how it goes because it's so different from other games. Some people might not like the slight competition-based nature of it. I know there was some discussion about that in our end debriefing in our final session. And because the players can have different specialties, like I said, the arts and oration or the blood and valor or the spirit and resolve, players can have slightly different focuses, which means that you need to kind of make sure as a GM that you've got different challenges throughout a session to do that. Finally, there are a couple of unclear points, minor things like what does a bond with a god do? How are you adjudicating advantage dice? There are a couple of other little things like where this Vault of Heaven phase falls in the turn sequence, but these are all minor things. I would say this is a great game. I would gladly run this more. One of the things that's been interesting is I think it's super adaptable. I know Alan and David, they've been talking about how this could be adapted to Celtic myths. Somebody mentioned Journey to the West. These are all traveling stories where you arrive at a place and there's a problem going on there. You know, it reminds me a little bit of how Fellowship sets things up, but this is more tightly focused. I really like RuneQuest and their Glorantha setting, and I can imagine adapting this to doing the hero quests for that. So, really happy. Questions? Thoughts? Comments?
So you mentioned RuneQuest. That's a big one. Then you said only the Dream Quests?
Yeah, so RuneQuest, the Glorantha setting, has a very weird but grounded fantasy setting, swords and sorcery and stuff. But then you've got this idea that sometimes heroes have to go up to the god plane to enact stories and change the world through them or get the favor of the gods through them. And I can imagine using the Agon system to do that hero quest portion. Like you could do a real conventional, even OSR version of RuneQuest on the ground, but then when you go up to the mythic plane, you might have to get the help of your village or the blessings of the gods and then go up and enact those stories and make changes from those.
But that's interesting because those are stories, like particular stories. So if you took a set of companions up there and one of them got more glory from an important act than you did with your runes for your god, that would have ramifications.
Yeah, because there's a certain amount of when we get to the end of the sort of the island, there's a big multi-stage blowout with the bad guy, and whoever wins kind of gets to choose how the final battle gets resolved, and the group decides sort of what the stakes are. So there is a little bit of that getting to make those choices.
Interesting.
Yeah, this sounds interesting. I'd never heard of this game, and just when you started talking about it, before you got to the flexibility, it sounded good. I can see this, to date myself, being like a dot hack or a Sword Art Online game. Like, you go to the next level up on the MMO, you have new quests to do to get up to the next level, and also, like what you said, I immediately went to the Wandering Warrior kind of stories of Japan and other parts of Asia. It looks like it could be really adaptable outside of even a Greek focus.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be great one-on-one, but I think we had 4 players, which was good. I almost think 3 players might even be stronger, give a little more room for that to get that sort of tighter role and interaction there. I also ran it in a 3-hour slot. I will say this is a game that could be much better running it a 4-hour slot. David Walker made that point at the end, and I think that's true. But there's so many of these wonderful journey stories. You travel, you go and you fix something, and then you move on, and there's some implications, some changes that are the sort of for the meta, and this does that. So there's a lot to it. It's a good game. Listeners, let's move on to our second segment.
Hello listeners, I wanted to let you know about Codex Hearthfire, the newest issue of the Gauntlet's tabletop role-playing game magazine, now available on Patreon. Hearthfire includes Packet, a game about the transatlantic journey from Liverpool to New York in the 1800s. Can you navigate the troubled waters between hope and home? Respite, a game of comfort and companionship through adversity, explored via stories told around a communal fireplace between battles. The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soulless, a new mystery for Brindlewood Bay. Trophy Gold Hearthfire, a major expansion for Trophy Gold that adds new storytelling options to downtime and upkeep. 36 precarious places to make camp, 9 original illustrations, and a beautiful custom layout. You can get Codex Hearthfire in the Gauntlet Patreon feed by making a $6 pledge in July. Your pledge helps support all the great work we do in the Gauntlet, including our Gauntlet Open Gaming Weekends and this very podcast. Thanks.
For our second segment, we're going to be talking with our guest about a topic of their choice or project they're working on. So Sawyer, what are you doing with Fahrenheim Games? Tell us about what you're working on.
My current project is, again, tied to Monsterhearts 2, like my other two are. Please check out my skins for Fahrenheim Games. But I've seen the core skins get played in so many different varieties that I wanted to augment them in ways. Like, I think the most obvious one of this would probably be the ghoul, how I've done that, which, as the ghoul as is a great addiction metaphor, a great power-hungry teen, but Monsterhearts is about romance, and to me, like, the idea of the perfect partner made or brought back to life, like Bride of Frankenstein, Galatea, that kind of thing made me do the Bride overlay for Monsterhearts, and the idea for overlays are to give at least one new stat line, new options for the identities, the basics of your looks, your eyes, your origins, and either new or altered moves, new or altered backstories, sex moves, and darkest selves, depending on the overlay, to invoke a different style of play. I'm trying not to completely overshadow the metaphor of the skin, but to try and alter it to fit a different outlook, a different facet. I'm trying to do one of each for the basics in the vein of westernized or the culture I grew up in outlook. And after that, I want to try and move on to a different culture, because being someone of Japanese heritage, like when I think of the ghost, there's a lot of different ghosts out there in the Japanese mythos. It's the joke I hear of horror movies is not, are we haunted, but what are we haunted by? And I've been talking with Jamila about how to get some Filipino lore into these overlays, and one of the overlays was played in the Dark Americana Absolution game I'm going to be trying, which is one I've seen get very badly done time and time again, the Windigo. So for what I did with my Windigo overlay is I actually talked to Algonquin people. I do worry, I guess, coming from, for lots of these not being part of the culture, that I might ham-fist it, I might get something wrong or something off, but the cultural skins, I'm trying to work with sensitivity readers, sensitivity people of the culture, if I'm not of that culture or have not, don't have a good grasp at all, to make sure I'm getting things right, looking up the actual historical facts of the myth if I can, what the myth means. Like Jamie pointed out that for the Oswong, if you're in Manila, that is completely different if you're on the other side of the Philippines. They can be different things. They could have stood for different outlooks in the culture. And I think that's a good idea. Like, there is no set, like, even in your own culture, there is no set in stone idea of what a monster might be or what this might mean.
So give me an example with one of these overlays of, like, what changes have you made to moves, since moves are always kind of the big thing. Give me an example of a new move or a changed move.
I like the custom moves. Apocalypse World really helped me create those ideas of custom moves. But to go in the mortal overlay I'm doing is one called the Thrall. So instead of having a true love, you are basically the right hand, the mortal mook, the Igor, the Renfield of a monster. And I have altered a true love to true loyalty. It's not a major alter, but you have one boss. And any moves that would refer to your true love now refer to your boss. You can swear allegiance to another boss, of course, and give them a string on you like you can with the true loves. And you always carry one forward to doing your boss's bidding. You are a great pawn. But that will replace the True Love move. So this skin doesn't have True Love, can maybe buy it as a move from another skin from an advance. And their other custom move, which is much more custom than the altered True Loyalty, replaces the move Excuses Are My Armor. I call it Soul Fetters, where since your boss is always going to be supernatural, you may give your boss one string on you to use one of their skin moves or their custom reaction once. But on the downside, your boss may pull strings on you even if you aren't in the same scene.
Oh, that is cool.
So when you're bringing these facets forward, are you playing with different types of monstrousness or with different types of pathos for the monsters?
I believe it can depend on the overlay, but the short answer will be both. The long answer depends on what group you're doing. If you're I think it will depend on all player choices. If you are playing a mortal thrall and someone's a dragon and that's your thrall, that will be a very different flavor and very different pathos than if your master is the vampire. But it also gives you a different experience than being a love-struck teenager to being a teenager who would sell their soul for a bit of power or a bit of prestige, like an Instagram follower or influencer.
Interesting. And how many of them would you say are sort of reactions to ones that you, like with the Windigo, where you said you'd seen them played badly, where you kind of want to make a version that feels better to you?
Many of these I've seen as third-party skins that just did not... With third-party skins, I see a lot of people take either the monster or the metaphor and then not focus on the fact of bringing them together. And to me, an overlay, you don't need to make a new metaphor. You can just express it in a different outlook. So you can get that feeling of being different or being prestige classed and still get the same Monsterhearts experience.
So you keep that underlying balance that the designer built right in there.
The mortal may be the thrall now, but that does not mean that the mortal's desire for belonging, desire for acceptance is not still there. It's just stronger in a different direction.
So now you've already got a set of skins that you've released and are available on drive-thru.
My first round of skins are available on both drive-thru and itch.io.
Okay.
They were in the racial equality bundle as well for that wonderful cause. And I also have reskins, which are 7 updated skins from Skins for the Skinless. Got a permission to do that by Topher Gurki, thanks to the people on the Gauntlet as well. A completely different take on the Angel from Monsterhearts 1. It is not anything like the Monsterhearts 1 Angel, so you don't get disappointed. Ooh. And 2 completely new ones out of my mind. And
then the overlays is a project you're working on sort of longer term.
Overlays are what I started working on in quarantine, and just I'm at the point where I think I can get the first batch out soon. And I'm probably going to make it a pay-what-you-want title, because it feels like these aren't complete skins.
Mm-hmm.
They're as I said, they're like prestige classes. And they should be fun, they should add things to the game, but I don't want to make them price gate-kept.
Right, yeah, that's smart. Awesome. Well, let's move to our final segment. Listeners, for our final segment, we discuss something that's been inspiring us or giving us joy. So, Sherry, what's giving you life?
Oh my gosh. So this has been a crazy up and down time. Had a huge project that I had to get done. And then even after the project, it took me a full 2 weeks to kind of come back to normalcy. But my little vacation through the midst of that, and even still now, was stumbled upon an anime called My Next Life as a Villainess, All Routes Lead to Doom. And it is a little bit of comfy, cozy harem anime. Usually I'm kind of like, ooh, that's a little weird after a while, but this one is just sort of, it's a person who desperately wants to be liked so that they won't kill her, and the end of the story is essentially it. And she has all kinds of miscommunications. So she's a young heiress, and she gets bumped on the head, and when she wakes up, she realizes that her world is actually the story of an otome video game that she played in a past life. And she knows all the outcomes, all the different outcomes of when the heroine comes through and chooses who they're going to marry. Like, for them, she, the villainess, is going to end up either doomed or exiled. So she begins right from the beginning, while she's 9 years old, prepping for that day where she can avoid being killed, or if she gets exiled, can like make a life of it on her own. So she's like, even though she's a little noble, she's out there trying to do a farm and raise plants, and she's friends with everyone, and she tries to be helpful. And her fiance, she keeps going, really, if you find out that you fall in love with someone, just say the word and I'll back right off. So all of these characters that in the video game were like rivals or people who disliked her are like her circle, a cadre of friends, and they're all in love with her because she's tried so hard to be the friend they need so they won't want her to die. And so it's this kooky, cozy, funny little anime, and it was just the kind of thing that you need when you're in the depths of too much. I thought it was just pretty easy to watch.
And she's wonderfully aware of all the endings, but she's super clueless about actually what is now happening. Like, she has no idea that these people are actually now in love with her, which is wonderful. It's on Crunchyroll. It's really good. Sawyer, what's giving you life?
I have broken out my first ever video game system purchase of my life, the original launch PS1 that still works.
Oh.
And I played my original PS1 launch game, Tecmo's Deception, Invitation to Darkness, which I have no idea if many people know of, but the first one had blatant Satanism in it during the mid-90s, was actually part of the reason that the Satanic Panic died out, because the game was considered so inoffensive story-wise and so badly written that it couldn't be satanic. Tecmo's Deception series has always been a big part of my life. I think one of the next tattoos I'm going to get may come from the game, but just reliving this old, early 3D game with all these clunks and stuff, and like every time I'd get an item in that janky 3D modeling, it was just this calming bit of nostalgia that the reactionaries haven't ruined yet. And it felt like paying off a loan to Tom Nook in real life.
Yes. I remember playing one of those on a demo disc, and I was just like, what is this thing? Oh, that's a great pick. For me, it's a video game as well. This last month, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition came out. I played Xenoblade Chronicles on the Wii, and I loved it. It's one of my favorite RPGs of all time. It's expansive. It's beautiful. It's got a really wild combat system. The Definitive Edition is super pretty. It cleans up things. It adds some quality of life adjustments, and it's just been a pleasure to go back and revisit these areas because they're so big. And unlike a lot of games where you're running from place to place and you're like, okay, it's taking a while, there's always something to see. There's always something to see in this game, and always something to do. And that's just been an absolute joy. Listeners, that is our show. Sawyer, thank you for joining us today.
Not a problem. Happy to have been here.
Sherry, thank you for co-hosting.
Always a joy.
Listeners, if you want, you can subscribe to our podcast on your podcatcher of choice. Rating and reviewing always helps us. If you want to support us, we have a Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. You can find out about that. It supports our Gauntlet community, our network of shows. We also have a magazine codex. If you want to get a hold of us, you can reach us at Gauntlet RPG on Twitter. And if you want to follow up and check more about the Gauntlet online gaming community and things, you can find out more about that at gauntlet-rpg.com. So that's our show. Thank you all so much.